Yeah, sure. Are there any historical documentation If you believe John, then Nicodemus is good evidence. But there's no extra sources. You ready? Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome back to our second keynote of the day. Hopefully we all enjoyed thoroughly our first keynote from Dr. William Lane Craig and then our fantastic breakout sessions. And hopefully also you got to browse some of the tables that are out in the lobby. These are our table sponsors for this event. These are some of the people that made this event happen. So we would like to personally thank Keith Garvin, Houston Chinese Church, Reasonable Faith, Risen Jesus Incorporated, the George Monats, Evidence for Faith, Apologetics Ministry, and Ratio Christi. Now, Ratio Christi is a chapter at Houston Christian University and also has multiple chapters all across the country. We have multiple campuses represented here this morning. And finally, Mr. Channing Ward. We thank all of our table sponsors for putting on this great event, and if you meet any of those people, shake their hand. Okay. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Professor Michael Licona. He is one of the world experts on the stuff that you are about to hear him talk about. He has published multiple books in top-tier presses, Oxford University Press, all of the best academic publications in the world. He is here talking about gospel differences, the Gospels as historical texts, why we should believe them to be reliable. He teaches a course for us every year on the philosophy of history and the resurrection. So if you like what he says today, then enroll in our Master of Arts in Apologetics and you get to hear him more. But Mike Licona is not only a top-notch scholar, he is also a dear, dear, kind man who would love to take the time to meet you. And once again, as Keith Garvin said, it's so refreshing to see somebody that has both an incredibly sharp intellect and an incredibly genuine zeal for the Lord and for the Lord's church. So please welcome please welcome Michael Licona to the stage.
Thank you, and thanks, Austin. Well, today we can search just about anything in terms of the top 3, top 5, top 10. For example, there's the top 5 movies of 2023. There's the top 2 stock picks. There's the top 10 plays of the week. There's the top 3 knockouts in boxing and the UFC. There's the top 10 subcompact pistols. Yay, Texas. Isn't it wonderful to live in the South? Don't you think so too, Megan? Fellow, yeah. And then, of course, there's the top Christian university in the world. Well, Dr. Craig gave us a little bit ago in his first lecture, he gave us some evidence, strong historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and argued that the resurrection hypothesis fulfills the criteria of inference to the best explanation. What I'm going to do in this next 30 minutes is I'm going to address the top 3 objections to the resurrection of Jesus. Now, there are many different ones that have been given over the years, but I'm going to cover the top 3. So you ready? Let's jump right into it. Number 3, contradictions in the Gospels. Now, Bart Ehrman is probably the most influential skeptical New Testament scholar in the world. He teaches at UNC Chapel Hill. And he has a little shtick that he does against the Gospels. He'll say, well, Was Jesus crucified after the Passover meal or before it? Well, it depends which gospel you read. Did Simon of Cyrene carry Jesus' cross all the way? Or help Jesus carry his cross, or did Jesus carry it all the way? It depends which gospel you read. Did Pilate deliver Jesus over to be crucified at 9 a.m. or at noon? It depends which gospel you read. When Jesus was crucified between two thieves, did both thieves curse him, or did one repent? It depends which gospel you read. Did the temple veil split in half before Jesus' death or after? It depends which gospel you read. What were Jesus' last words on the cross? It depends which gospel you read. Then when it comes to the resurrection, okay, did the women get up and go to the tomb while it was still dark, or was it light out? It depends which gospel you read. How many women went? It depends which gospel you read. When they got there, how many angels did they see? It depends which gospel you read. When they came back and notified the disciples, how many of them went to the tomb? It depends which gospel you read. Where did Jesus meet his group of male disciples first? Was it Jerusalem or Galilee? It depends which gospel you read. And how long was he with them after the resurrection? It depends which gospel you read. And after Ehrman is finished going through all these differences in the gospels, the Christians sitting there in the pews are thinking, say it ain't so. It's so. So how are we to approach this when it comes to the gospel differences? Well, let me look at 3 different approaches, and all of them work, I think. Number 1, recognize that Christianity is true because Jesus rose. Now, why on earth is that an approach to gospel differences? Actually, this is the most important one, folks. And let me explain why through a story that happened back in 1989. I was experiencing a crisis of faith at that point. And so I called Gary Habermas up. He's a philosophy professor, probably the leading proponent in the world on the topic that we're covering this weekend, the resurrection of Jesus. Just came out with volume 1 of his magnum opus. It's 1,095 pages long. That's volume 1. There are 4 volumes. And I remember calling him up. There was no email in 1989. I called him up and I said, Doc, you know that a lot of scholars today don't think that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels. And if we don't know who wrote them, then how can we trust anything in them? And I'm just going on and I'm saying, Doc, it's really rocking my faith. He listened patiently to me and then he said, Mike, did Jesus rise from the dead? Yeah? Mike, why do you believe that? Well, Doc, you came up with what you call the minimal facts approach. You take facts that are so strongly supported by the data that virtually all scholars who studied the subject, or at least a vast majority of them, grant them as facts, and then you take those facts alone and you can build a very strong and compelling case for the resurrection based solely on those facts. So yeah, he rose from the dead. He said, and if Jesus rose, is Christianity true? Yeah. Well, then why are you allowing the matter of authorship of the Gospels to rock your faith? So, Mike, there's some good evidence that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote them, but if they didn't, Jesus still rose and Christianity's true. I never thought of that before. Well, Doc, what do you do with all these apparent errors and contradictions in the Gospels? You know, you got all these different things. Mike, did Jesus rise from the dead? Yeah. Mike, we got answers to a lot of the different errors and contradictions in the Gospels, but let's say that we're all wrong on this. Did Jesus still rise? Yes. Then why are you allowing the matter of gospel differences to rock your faith? All right, I think I see where you're coming from now. But what do you do with the genocide text in the Old Testament? I mean, Mike, did Jesus rise from the dead? That was a game changer for me, folks, because now I recognize that if Jesus rose from the dead, it's game, set, match. Christianity is true, period. And it doesn't matter what objection they bring up against it, Christianity is still true if Jesus rose. And we see that there's really good evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, despite any of these, if any of these objections would hold in terms of the New Testament Gospels. So that's one thing. I think it's the most important. Don't get over concerned about it. This is Gary Habermas. And we were talking about it. I said, Gary, what do you think is the #1 Christian university in the world? Yeah. They visit us every year. They spend a week with us, Gary and his wife, Eileen. Number 2, we got to ask, are we looking at a contradiction or a difference? And we need to make a distinction between them. Now, a little over 100 years ago, there was the Titanic. It sank, and more than half of its passengers perished in the process due to a lack of lifeboats. Now, afterward, when the survivors were being interviewed, some of the survivors said that the Titanic broke in two just prior to sinking, and others said, it went down intact. Well, how do you get that wrong? But no one turned around and said, well, I guess the Titanic didn't sink. They just know that there was some typical misunderstanding, misperceptions among some of the eyewitnesses on minor details. Doesn't change the fact that the Titanic sank. But anyway, that is a contradiction. Now, let's look at a difference. Let's say I go home, I get home tonight, and my wife is really excited, and she says, you won't believe this, but an hour ago, the doorbell rang. I went to the door, and this guy has this check for $10 million. He says, congratulations, Mrs. Licona, you've won Publishers Clearinghouse. And then a little bit later, I hear her talking to a friend, one of her friends on the phone, and she says, you won't believe this, the doorbell rang, I went, there's two guys at the door. One has this check for $10 million, the other guy's video recording it. She gets off the phone, and I say, I don't believe it now. You contradicted yourself because to me, you said there was just one guy at the door. To your friend, you said there were two. She would say, I didn't say there was just one. I only mentioned one, the important one, the one with the check. But that's not a contradiction. It's a difference. Let's look at a couple of these things in the Gospels. And there are lots of them, folks. How many women went to the tomb? Well, Matthew, Mark, and Luke say that there were multiple women. But John, chapter 20, verses 1 and 2, early in the morning while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene got up, went to the tomb, and found it empty. And so she runs back and finds Peter and the beloved disciple and says, they have taken the Lord, and we don't know where they've laid him. Who's we? You wouldn't say it's Peter, the beloved disciple, and Mary, because Peter and the beloved disciple didn't even know that the tomb was empty until 15 seconds prior when Mary arrived. No, she's referring to the other women. And then guess what? They get up, or how many people go to the tomb? John reports that Peter and the beloved disciple got up, and they went to the tomb and found it as Mary had said. Luke 24:12 says that Peter got up and ran to the tomb and found it as the women had said. Well, which was it? Was it just Peter, or was it Peter and the beloved disciple? Well, Luke doesn't say just Peter. He only mentions Peter. But 12 verses later, Luke 24:24, he's talking to the Emmaus disciples. And as Bill said earlier, their eyes were kept from recognizing him, Luke says. And so they're walking along talking, and Jesus says, hey, fellas, why are you so sad? And they said, well, Jesus, we thought he was the Messiah. We thought he was a prophet. But they just crucified him. But some of our women folk went to the tomb this morning and found it empty and said they saw angels who said he'd been raised. And then some of our own, plural, some of our own went to the tomb and found it as the women had said. But Luke, we don't do that today where you just mention one, but you know others are present. Well, yes, you guys do. But even if you didn't, it doesn't matter because Matthew, Mark, John, and me did not form a committee for the misleading of future historians and readers. We were writing according to the literary conventions of our day. It's not a contradiction, it's a difference. And then we have the Gospels. Number 3, the Gospels are ancient biographies. And ancient biographers took liberties in the way they wrote. Okay? So, how many of you are married in here? Lots of you. Okay. Well, you all know what I'm talking about when I say there's the guy version of a story and the girl version, right? Now, of course, I'm stereotyping here. There are many exceptions. But for the most part, women like details, don't they? At least this is the way it is with my wife and I. She likes details, and lots of them. She wants to know what happened, where it happened, why it happened, how it happened, who was there, what they were doing, what they were wearing, what they were saying, what they were thinking, and how they were feeling. And then she wants to know how you feel about it. Now, us guys are different. We like bullet points. I like bullet points. Get to the bottom line. The game's coming on in 5 minutes, right? I mean, we'll be there. She'll be telling the story, and I'm going, all right, can you speed this up a little bit, right? And so it's like with a baby. Now, I know some people here, babies don't get offended at this, but someone might tell me they had a baby. I'll come home, I'll tell my wife, hey, so-and-so had a baby. They wanted you to know. Well, is it a boy or girl? Don't know. How much did it weigh? I don't know. What's its name? I don't know. But the women, they will know all these details, right? We just want the bottom. Hey, she had a baby. That's the bottom line. That's the way, guys, a lot. Again, there are many exceptions to the rule, but they're just different ways of telling a story. I'm not saying one's better than the other. They're just different ways with different objectives. Well, if you want the girl version of the story, you go to Mark. If you want the guy version, you go to Matthew in the Gospels. Serious. So let me just give you a couple of examples here. So there's an occasion when Jesus and his disciples are walking along the road going to their next place. And the disciples, according to Mark, are arguing amongst themselves which one of them is the greatest. And so when they take a little break, Jesus comes up to them and he says, so what were you fellows arguing about along the way? And they're embarrassed and they won't answer him. Now, then you come to Matthew's gospel. He gives us the guy version. They come right up to Jesus. Hey, Jesus, which one of us is the greatest? Which one do you think is what we would have seen had we been there? Probably like Mark has it. Matthew's just simplifying, getting to the bottom line. It is a pattern of Matthew to do this throughout his gospel. Let me show you one other example. Jesus' baptism. Jesus is baptized. He comes out of the water. God's voice comes out of heaven. And Mark and Luke report that God's voice says, you are my beloved son. In you I am well pleased. Matthew reports that the voice said, this is my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased. The difference, of course, is that in Mark and in Luke, God's voice is directly addressing Jesus, where it's directly addressing the crowd, the witnesses, in Matthew. Now, of course, we can try to harmonize this if we want and say, well, God spoke twice. He spoke to Jesus, and then he spoke to the crowd. In fact, this is what the Gospel of the Ebionites does in the 2nd century. But I think Augustine was probably correct when he said that Matthew changed who was being addressed here so that the readers would feel that it was a little more personable to them. God is speaking to them in affirming his son. Now, I've got so many of these examples, but I've got a book that was already published on this in 2017. I have a new one coming out May 28th. Shameless plug here. Jesus Contradicted, Why the Gospels Tell the Same Story Differently. Available for pre-order on Amazon. All right, this brings us to our number 2 objection against the resurrection hypothesis, hallucinations. Now, this does seem reasonable, doesn't it? That a hallucination, I mean, think about this for a moment. These guys were grieving over Jesus' death. They loved him. They'd lived with him and traveled with him for 1.5 to 3 years. All of a sudden, he's arrested, brutally tortured, and executed. Within 24 hours, he's dead. What a shock. What an emotional shock. Well, you would think hallucinations, it does sound plausible. Well, let's talk a little about what hallucinations are. Hallucination is a false sensory perception. You believe you're perceiving something with your natural senses that isn't really there. A visual hallucination where you see something that's not there. An auditory hallucination where you think you're hearing something, maybe someone calling your name, but no one called your name. An olfactory hallucination where you smell, or gustatory where you taste something. Or how about a kinesthetic hallucination, one in which you have a sense of motion, like when you're sleeping and you have a dream that you're falling and then you wake up. That's called a kinesthetic hallucination. Or how about a tactile hallucination, the sense of touch. You remember when you got your first cell phone and you pulled it out, or you were ready to go into a lecture or a sermon and you put it on vibrate so it would be silent, and you stuck it in your pocket or somewhere, and in the middle of that lecture, you felt like you got a text, and you pulled it out and you looked at it? Nobody loves me. That is a tactile hallucination. You have the sense of feel, but you really didn't feel anything. So all of us have experienced a hallucination at some time or another in our lives. Now, hallucinations typically occur in a single mode, so you may see something, but you will not see and hear something. Multiple studies have shown that people that tend to see and hear something or experience multiple modes are those who are either high on drugs or they're schizophrenics. Other than that, when you experience a hallucination, it's usually in a single mode. Now, the kind of person that's most inclined to experience a hallucination are senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one. And approximately 50% of them experience a hallucination. But 39% of all senior adults, when they experience that hallucination, they just sense the person's presence in the room. They don't smell their perfume or hear them or see them. They just sense that they're present in the room. Only 7% experience a visual hallucination. So think about this. 7% in the earliest reports, and Bill Craig shared these a little bit earlier, in 1 Corinthians 15, what percentage of the disciples experienced hallucinations? 100%. Not 7%, but an unthinkable 100%. He appeared to the 12. He appeared to all of the apostles. That's just in the early oral tradition in 1 Corinthians 15. And then you've got the gospel resurrection narratives that report 100% on multiple appearances to the group of male disciples. Another problem is the fact that they appeared in groups. It's not just 100%, but it appeared in groups. Now, hallucinations, because they are false sensory perceptions that are going on in your mind, and they have no external reality. In that sense, they are like dreams. I couldn't wake up my wife in the middle of the night and say, honey, I'm having a dream. I'm in Maui. Go back to sleep. Join me in my dream. Let's have a free vacation. You can't do that because it's going on in your head. Now, she might go back. We might both dream that we're in Maui, but it's not the same dream. If I gave every one of you a sleeping pill and said, let's all go to sleep, okay? Let's all go to sleep and let's dream we're in Maui. Would all of us dream we're in Maui? Mm-mm. And when we woke up and talked about being in Maui, those of us who did have such a dream, would it be describing the same dream? No. So it would have to be that these disciples had all these hallucinations while they were together simultaneously, and the content of those hallucinations would have had to have been so similar that they all thought they saw the same thing. And it just doesn't work. In 2008, the American Psychological Association published the book, Hallucinations, The Science of Idiosyncratic Perception. And in that book, the two co-authors, Ehlman and Laurie, they had surveyed all the medical literature by the mental health profession of more than a century's work on hallucinations. And I read it, interesting stuff. That's where I'm getting some of the stuff on hallucinations I'm sharing with you. And I contacted the authors, and Laurie got back to me. I had asked him, I said, why didn't you guys, I was expecting to read a chapter on group hallucinations. He said, yep, we anticipated we'd write one on group hallucinations, but we couldn't find a single documented case. And I said, what about the fact that they're mental events, they have no external reality? He says, yeah, that makes it impossible to have a group hallucination. So, the problem with the group hallucination is that you've got several of these. You've got, he appeared to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500, and then he appeared to all of the apostles. That's in the early oral tradition of 1 Corinthians 15. And then again, you've got the resurrection narrative. So it wasn't the fact that he appeared to groups, that makes it very difficult to describe that as a hallucination. And then you got the problem with Paul. Paul was out persecuting the church. He believed Jesus was a failed Messiah and a false prophet. So Jesus would have been the last person in the universe that Paul would have expected to see or wanted to see. Now, there are several other problems with the hallucination hypothesis. I'm just giving you 3 of them right there. I mean, I could say also that it doesn't lead to the belief that Jesus had been raised bodily, physically from the dead. It wouldn't explain the empty tomb and things like this. But these 3 alone provide significant challenges to the hallucination hypothesis. And that brings us to our number 1 objection against the resurrection hypothesis today, and that is miracles. And this objection is stated in a number of different ways. It's actually not an alternative explanation to the known historical facts. Instead, it is an attempt to disqualify any kind of investigation or talk about the resurrection in historical terms. And like Bill said earlier, when you start to talk about like the identical twin hypothesis, you're getting desperate. And to me, this shows some desperation on the part of skeptics today. Other than that, the hallucination hypothesis is the number 1 actual alternative hypothesis that is given by skeptics today. But the tendency of skeptics is not even to say hallucinations. You'll find some like Bart Ehrman or John Dominic Crossan, Stephen Patterson, some others, but for the most part, they go with this number 1. And here's one way to state it. Historians cannot investigate miracle claims because as historians, they don't possess the tools to detect God, who would be the cause of the miracle. Now, this is stated in a couple different ways, but let's look at those. This is Bart Ehrman. I showed him a little photo of him a little earlier. He defines miracle as being the least probable explanation. And so his argument is this: historians must choose the most probable explanation. Since a miracle, by its very definition, is the least probable explanation, a historian can never choose a miracle hypothesis as what actually occurred. Now, there's a few things we could say about this. Number 1, when I was doing my research, I found 23 different definitions posited by historians and philosophers of history for miracle. So there's no reason why we would need to accept this one. In fact, I think this is really a horrible definition anyway. And the reason being is because I would say least probable in reference to what? I mean, if the hypothesis is Jesus was raised naturally from the dead, well, sure. Then we'd say a miracle would be the least probable explanation. But I don't know of anyone who is positing that Jesus was raised by natural causes. The claim is that God raised Jesus, or Jesus was raised by a supernatural cause. And if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, then the resurrection becomes the most probable explanation. The probability is 100%, if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus. The problem with this is that in order to get this, to say it's the least probable or the most probable, you have to either to assume that God does not exist and a priori exclude him, or you have to assume that he does exist and would want to raise Jesus. And so now you're umpiring and judging these hypotheses based on your worldview, not on the data. And the danger in that is manifest. Bad philosophy corrupts good history. So that's a problem to say it's the least probable explanation. Least probable in reference to what? There's another way to put it, methodological naturalism. Now, Ehrman states this a little bit differently. He'll say, well, since it would require God to say that Jesus rose from the dead, a miracle explanation, that would be a theological explanation, not a historical one. But what Ehrman is doing there is he's confusing with a historical conclusion with its theological implications. These are 2 different things. And you shouldn't rule out a historical conclusion because you can't stomach the implications of it. So that's one problem. But it really goes to methodological naturalism. Now, methodological naturalism is different from what's called metaphysical naturalism. Metaphysical naturalism is atheism. It is to say the only thing that exists is the natural world. Nothing else exists. That is a philosophy. Methodological naturalism says, well, we're not going to touch on the metaphysical. We're not going to touch on whether God exists or doesn't exist. But as scientists or as historians, we do not have the tools to be able to detect God. I mean, what would such a tool even look like? Scientists and historians, their tools can only look at what's in the natural world. They can draw implications, perhaps, of this, but they can only test the things in the natural world. And so you could only come to natural conclusions. So that's methodological naturalism as it's typically practiced. But there's a problem with this. I think we can still do a methodological naturalism, but it's got to be a better, a nuanced one, an improved form. And I put this this forward to some atheists during public debates. Annie, you're in here, aren't you? Annie, where are you at? Well, oh, don't worry about it. Anyway, she lives in Austin. She wouldn't have been at this debate, but several years ago in Austin, I had a debate with Matt Dillahunty. It's my most viewed, no, it isn't. It's second most viewed debate. It's got over 800,000 views. So in there, I raised this, and I've also raised it with Bart Ehrman. Now, let's just say that scientists that have been able to see that there's a comet that is headed toward the Earth, and on a specific day and time, it is scheduled to slam into the moon's surface. And when that day comes, you have the Hubble Space Telescope, it's zeroed in on the moon. You got planetariums around the world, and their telescopes are zoomed in on the moon's surface. And at the predicted time, bam, the moon crashed, or the comet crashes into the moon. And as the lunar dust settles, there's a message written on the moon's surface, and it says, Jesus is Lord. And it's written in Hebrew and in Greek. Now, here's what a good scientist would do. A good scientist would say, wow, that's an extraordinary event. I have no natural explanations for it. In fact, it would seem to require God. But as a scientist, I do not possess the tools to detect God. So all I can do is I can affirm the event occurred and leave the cause of the event undetermined, unspecified. Here's what a naive scientist would say. Wow, that's an extraordinary event. I have no natural explanations for it. It would seem to require God, but as a scientist, I don't have the tools capable of detecting God. So I don't know if the event itself occurred. This is exactly this crazy approach that Bart Ehrman and many, the majority of skeptical scholars are saying today when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus. Yeah, I don't care about the evidence. I don't care about the evidence because even if Jesus rose, I mean, that would be God raising him, and I don't have the tools, so I can't affirm whether the event itself occurred. They're doing the same crazy approach to it. And then finally we've heard this watchword amongst many skeptics. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But what does it mean to say it's extraordinary evidence? Does it glow? What they're really saying is the evidence has to be so good that it's a burden of proof that's impossible to meet. But does extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? I don't think so. Let me give you a hypothetical and explain why I don't think it does. So I don't believe that intelligent aliens have ever come to Earth from another planet. Now, I'm open to being wrong on this, but I don't think they've ever come. And my hesitation for believing it is not theological. I'm entirely open to God creating another kinds of people on another planet somewhere, intelligent people on another planet somewhere else in the universe. I don't see why he couldn't do something like that or wouldn't do something like that. I don't know. I don't care. But why don't I believe they've ever visited Earth? Well, several years ago, I had a conversation with astronomer Hugh Ross, and he told me that the closest planet capable of sustaining life is approximately 23,000 light years away. And he says, of course, no one could ever make that trip. They wouldn't. I mean, it would take 24 generations minimum each of which lived as long as Methuselah in order to get here, right? And Hugh said we could never, it's impossible to travel at the speed of light. I'm not an astronomer, I don't know why, but he says it's impossible to travel at the speed of light. And he says, then you got the problem of space debris and radiation. No one could ever survive that kind of stuff. So because of these, I don't think that intelligent aliens have ever visited Earth. Now, let's suppose I'm home one day and my wife comes barreling in the door and she is just terrified. And she says, Mike, I calm her down and she says, I was just at the mall and I saw this spaceship in the parking lot and this horrific looking alien came out and people were terrified. They were jumping in their cars. They were driving away. They were crashing into one another. They were running over pedestrians. I've never seen anything like this. Now, my wife and I on April 4th will be married 37 years. And it's like, I know what she's like. I know when she's trying to pull my leg. And let's suppose I know that she's not. She's really being serious about this. Would this be enough to convince me aliens exist? I don't know. Maybe I'd think, well, it could have been a movie set and she was just unaware of it. But then let's suppose the doorbell rings and my neighbor comes in and she says, I was just at the grocery store and I saw this UFO and this horrible looking alien. Let's turn on the television. I turn on the television and all of these things, Fox News and ABC and CBS and the BBC, they all got these pictures of these flying saucers and aliens. It's happening all over the world, and CNN says, just teasing. But it's like you've got all these things, all these reports of this stuff happening. Well, I'm going to have to allow my view now I've got to permit the data to challenge my view. And that's going to be enough evidence to overturn my belief that aliens do not exist, at least that they visited the Earth. But would any of that evidence be extraordinary? Let's not confuse something here. The evidence, my wife, my neighbor, the television stations, they would all be reporting an extraordinary event. But would the evidence be extraordinary? I mean, why would that be extraordinary? For my wife to report that she saw an alien at the mall is no different than my wife reporting that she saw an old friend at the mall. I mean, it's her. She is the evidence here. She's the one that's providing the evidence. It's no different. The television, it's got fake news and all kinds of stuff all the time. So extraordinary claims do not require extraordinary evidence. Extraordinary claims require good evidence, sufficient evidence. Now, sufficient is a relative term, of course. And for some, like an atheist, it may take more evidence to convince them that Jesus rose from the dead. You might have to give evidence for God's existence. Now, I think if Jesus rose, you get 2 in 1. You get God's existence and Christianity, the truth of Christianity if Jesus rose. But the skeptic may want some more evidence for God's existence or evidence that the supernatural occurs in our space-time dimension today, that miracles actually occur. So, but I don't think it requires extraordinary evidence. So let's summarize. The top 3 objections: number 3, contradictions; number 2, hallucinations; and number 1, miracles. We can see that the resurrection hypothesis remains the very best explanation by far, the very best historical explanation of the facts. And what I will also say to skeptics is, hey, if you bracket your philosophical and theological biases against resurrection, at least you are rejecting it based on theological or philosophical assumptions rather than the historical. If you're just looking at the historical, the resurrection hypothesis comes out on top. Finally, the reason I think that this is so important is because we live in a dangerous time. Things are changing. Our culture is moving steadily toward the left. There's stuff that's going on in Scotland right now that's restricting freedom of speech. They've got a bill before Parliament in Canada right now that is to restrict free speech up there, and that you could be thrown into prison for life if you say the wrong thing to the wrong person. And we're just a few years behind Canada. We may get to a point within our lifetime, maybe within the next decade, where it's starting to look more like what our Chinese brothers and sisters have seen happening for decades now. And that to speak out against what the dominant view of the culture could cost you your job, could cost you your savings, could cost you your freedom, could cost you your life. And we're going to be given with the choice, and we're going to have to choose. Are we going to stand for Christ? We might have to do it underground, that's fine. But are we going to stand for Christ when it really comes down to it? Or are we going to put a premium on our savings, our jobs, the comforts in life that we've worked so hard for? And when it comes down to making these tough decisions, to recognize that Jesus actually rose from the dead, which shows Christianity is true, can make all the difference in the world. I hope you found this helpful. All right, let's go ahead and open it up for some questions.
All right, over here.
Howdy. So I had a question about the hallucinations argument that you made. You mentioned that 100% of the apostles saw the hallucinations. I know we're kind of working off of a minimal facts type argument where we're trying to only assert what's pretty commonly held. So how confident are we that all of the disciples had hallucinations, or versus maybe only some like Peter or James or Paul?
So, we actually have more evidence for the group appearances than we do for the individual appearances. So, like with the group appearances, he appeared to Peter, then to the 12, right? Now, Peter's one of the 12, so that's referring to a group appearance. Now, before you say, but wait a minute, Judas hanged himself, so there's 11, right? And Luke reports 11. So most scholars, even critics, will agree that the 12 became a nickname, for the 12, because they represent the 12 tribes of Israel. So he appeared to Peter, then to the 12. Then he appeared to all of the apostles. It says he appeared to more than 500 at one time. Then he appeared to James, then to all of the apostles. So the 100%, you got all the apostles, then he appeared to the 12. And then, if you go with the gospel accounts, which I think are historically reliable, you certainly have multiple independent accounts with some of these. You've got he appearing to all of them. Matthew has it in Galilee. Luke places it in Jerusalem. So you've got that. And then you've got another group appearance to all the apostles 8 days later in John when he appears to them, but Judas is with them at this point. So you do have the 100%. Does that help? Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is, by the way, my name is Jing. In Chinese means miracle.
Oh,
Thank
cool.
you very much.
So miracles do exist.
Absolutely. Thank you. My question is to the unbeliever. When they ask the early centuries, for about 200 years, there were no New Testament. What Christians at the time succeeded the holy teaching? Also after Pentecost, 33.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So you had, after the apostles, you have what are called the apostolic fathers. So Clement of Rome, he wrote a letter that is known today as First Clement. And there's some evidence that he was an associate of the Apostle Peter. And then you have Polycarp, who is probably a disciple of the Apostle John. Papias, he had 5 volumes of the Discourses of the Lord, which have been lost, unfortunately. But we have a number of fragments that have been preserved in the writings of other early church fathers. And he informs us that he knew, well, the language is a little bit ambiguous. It's hard to know and interpret it. And even Irenaeus, somewhere between the years 174 to 189, interpreted that he knew and hung out with the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee. But Eusebius interprets that as the elder John being another one of the apostles, but a minor one who had traveled, one of the 70 who had traveled with Jesus. So in any sense, he's getting it from an eyewitness, or at least someone who is an associate of an eyewitness. So, and then you had other, or what are called apostolic fathers, such as Ignatius, and he was a friend of Polycarp. So, and we've got 7 of his letters that he wrote. So, yeah, we've got their writings. Now, in terms of, you're right, the canon, as we know it today, did not get finalized until, well, it was more than 200 years later. I mean, you had different lists that were popping up. The early church fathers were all coming with different opinions. There was a core that was always accepted, so the 4 Gospels were always accepted. None of the other Gospels that did not make it into the New Testament were ever considered for inclusion. The book of Acts was always considered. 10 of Paul's 13 letters currently in the New Testament were never questioned. And it seemed like the other 3 were only questioned for a very, very short period of time. You have 1 Peter, 1 John, Hebrews. They were never questioned. So, but you do have 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, Jude, and Revelation. They were questioned, and they are still questioned today. And the big thing was who wrote these. And the authorship was the big question for these in antiquity. Yeah.
My name is Sarma. I'm convinced of the bodily resurrection of Jesus. How would you answer someone who says, well, hallucinations agreed with you, that they're not, I agree with you, they can't be seen in a group, but apparitions can be. Maybe this was a ghost. Maybe.
Oh, a ghost?
And in the 70s, our Jewish brethren started talking about the Lubavitch Rebbe in New Jersey, right? So there's a movement going on right now on the eastern seaboard of the resurrection of this rabbi. How would you answer people who say this is an apparition?
Not an apparition. By the way, that's Sarma. He's a dear friend of mine, and he's on the board of my ministry too. So love this man. And he lives here in Houston, by the way. And he's a physician who retired in his mid-30s. He's embarrassed now. But he's got a software company that detects sepsis, and yeah. I'm trying to think, the answer, because no. So an apparition, broadly defined, is the appearance of a spirit being. The apparition could be in space-time, or it could appear outside of space-time, like in a vision or a dream. It could be material, something you could touch, or it might be more like a ghost. I think that apparitions, for the most part, are hallucinations. But I think it's hard to refute that an apparition would be an actual spiritual being when the apparition appears to a group, or the apparition appears to a person who lacks grief, religious belief, or belief in an afterlife, or if the apparition imparts accurate information to the percipient they could not have otherwise known. When it comes to Jesus, all 3 of those are in play. He appeared to groups. He appeared to someone, he didn't lack religious belief, but he did lack grief, and he lacked belief in Christianity, Paul, right? And then, if the book of Acts is correct, which I think it is, the apparition imparts accurate information to Ananias, who tells Ananias to go see Paul and pray for him. And Ananias didn't know that Paul had converted or that Jesus had appeared to him. So you've got those three things. You could also add that apparitions, if you go with the Gospels and the reports we have in those, Jesus eats and he fixes breakfast for his disciples in John 21, which is something that apparitions can't do. So now, not every critic is going to grant you those accounts in the Gospels, and they're not going to grant you the story about Ananias in Acts. So, but you could say, it does appear, Jesus did appear to Paul. In other words, and when we say he appeared to Paul, what we're really saying is Paul had an experience that he interpreted as the risen Jesus appearing to him. And it just wouldn't be expected. And then he appeared to groups. Again, an apparition appearing to groups, if it's not a real spirit being, that gets very difficult to interpret. So that's how I would answer that.
We can do about 3 more questions, but we're going to do rapid fire, so like 30 seconds each. Okay.
Yep.
Dr. Licona, good to see you again. I think essentially my question is just this. How would you respond to the claim that people back then were simply less skeptical, and maybe even less skeptical than they should have been?
Yeah, good question. I don't know how much less skeptical they are. We're getting fooled by fake news all the time here. So, but yeah, even if they were, certainly Paul wasn't. Jesus would not have expected to see Jesus. So explanatory scope is being able to take, as Bill said earlier, to take and account for all of the facts. Now, if it were just the 12 disciples or just Peter, that might be one thing. The fact that if they're just overly, let's say, naive and they're not skeptical enough, you still have to explain the experiences they had that led them to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. The experiences happen in individual and in group settings to friend and foe alike. And hallucinations doesn't work. Legend doesn't work. Lies doesn't work. Lies don't work. Sorry about that. So you have all these things. You got to come up with a natural explanation. You just can't say, well, they were more skeptical, right? Is what I would say to the atheist. You've got to come up and what's your hypothesis of what happened? Yes, sir.
Yeah, about the part about contradictions, I appreciate where you talk about where in parallel gospels the writers may leave out details in one gospel or another, so it's really not a contradiction. But when it quotes that a voice from heaven said, and then there's a direct quotation of what the voice from heaven said, is there an issue where if the quotations are different in the gospels, the various gospels, but how do we reconcile that with the inerrancy? We would think that, this is inspired, that the actual quotation of the voice from heaven would be exactly the same in each gospel.
Yeah, good question. Certainly better than Sarma's. In the new book that's coming out in May, I have a chapter that deals with inspiration and another chapter that deals with inerrancy with this. So that would be the long answers that I'd be providing here. It just depends on how you are looking at inspiration. And unfortunately, Scripture does not inform us how Scripture is inspired, what inspiration actually means. The closest you come is 2 Timothy 3:16, which says, all Scripture is theopneustos, God-breathed. Well, what does theopneustos mean? Well, the term is only found about 50 times prior to Origen. So, and maybe only as many as 8 to 13 times, 8 to 13 times prior to Origen in the early 3rd century. Origen has it like 50 times, but 8 to 13 times prior to Origen, and maybe you've got 2 that predate Paul in the Sibylline oracles. So you have streams that feed in and help the Sibyls, which were pagan prophetesses. Those streams are called theopneustos. Dreams are called theopneustos, God-breathed. So there, some ointments are called theopneustos. So what does it mean? Well, we really don't know because there's not enough context. I think at minimum we can say that theopneustos or God-breathed means that something originates with God, but that's about as far as you can go with it. And then you got 2 Peter 2, verses 2 Peter 1, 20 and 21. It says, no prophecy a matter of one's own interpretation, but men moved by the Holy Spirit spoke from God. And that sounds more like a divine dictation kind of view right there. The word pharaoh in Greek is what's used there, and it does mean to be carried along, almost like divine dictation. But we know that it's not divine dictation because we can see that Matthew and Luke improve Mark's grammar on occasions. So it's not going to be that sometime the Holy Spirit is reading Mark again and thinking, you know what? I can do better than that. Let's say it this way in Matthew and Luke. There is definitely a human element in Scripture. It originates with God. There's a human element in it, and it's a labor to see how far exactly that human element actually goes. And I tried to deal with that in this next book. That's a little more than 20 seconds, sorry.
Yeah. All right, Mike, this is the last question because you're standing between these good folks and lunch. So we're going to give last question to this gentleman right here, and then we will dismiss for lunch, and we are back here for our afternoon breakouts at 1:30, okay?
My name's Nathan. Would you say, or is it right to say that people suppress the truth when they suppress the truth when they try to appeal to like theology and philosophy to deny the strong historical arguments for the resurrection?
Would I say that many people have a tendency to suppress the truth in their hearts when they see the evidence for the resurrection? Is that your question?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's it.
How's that for a short
Yeah,
answer?
that's a perfect closer. Could not be shorter. Okay, thank you, everyone. Give Professor Licona another hand. All right, if you look on your schedules, Houston Chinese Church has kindly provided many different good lunch options that are in the immediate vicinity. You are free to dismiss, find a friend, track down somebody that you want to meet, and we will reconvene in our assigned rooms on your schedule for our breakout sessions at 1:30.